Hello, thank you for joining me in my study. In my work on the atonement, I am not only examining exegetically the materials of the New Testament to understand the significance of the death of Christ, but I'm also looking at the history of the doctrine. And in doing this, I'm trying to read some of the principal theories of the atonement that have been offered over the centuries. And certainly one of the most significant of these will be St. Anselm's satisfaction theory. This is the same St. Anselm that developed the ontological argument. In his book, Cur Deus Homo, or Why the God Man, or Why God Became Man, is one of the classics on the doctrine of the atonement. Now, it's been decades since I read Cur Deus Homo. Here is my edition of the book that I bought when I was a student, and you can see how long ago this was from the price on the front, $1.20. Can you imagine getting the basic writings of St. Anselm today for $1.20? Well, what I've discovered in reading St. Anselm with fresh eyes is how terribly misrepresented his theory is in the secondary literature. It's typically presented as saying that Anselm focuses upon God's honor, and that we have dishonored God by our sin and therefore need to pay him back for the insult that we have rendered to him. And since we couldn't do that ourselves, Christ did this on our behalf. And the typical criticism of Anselm's theory is that it doesn't take any account of the moral reprehensibility of sin. It doesn't take any account of God's justice. It simply treats God as a feudal monarch whose honor has been impugned by our sin and who needs to be paid back. And so it's asked, why couldn't God just simply forgive us if it's just a matter of taking away his honor? Well, in reading St. Anselm, I was stunned to discover that this is a gross misrepresentation of Anselm's view. Let me read to you a few passages from chapters 12 and 13, where Anselm clearly frames his theory in terms of God's justice. He says in chapter 12, "Let's ask whether it were proper for God to put away sins by compassion alone, without any payment of the honor taken from him." And he says, "To remit sin in this manner is nothing else than not to punish. And since it is not right to cancel sin without compensation or punishment, if it be not punished, it is thereby passed over undischarged." In other words, Anselm's objection to God simply forgiving our sin is that this would not be right. And so he says it is therefore not proper for God to pass over sin unpunished. So Anselm's basic concern is with the justice of canceling sin without punishment or payment. He says in chapter 13, "There is nothing less to be endured than that the creature should take away the honor due to the Creator, nor restore what he has taken away. There is no greater injustice suffered than that by which so great an evil must be endured. God will not endure a thing than which no greater injustice is suffered, namely that the creature should not restore to God what he has taken away." And so Anselm's theory is fundamentally about God's justice. The reason God doesn't simply forgive everyone without payment or satisfaction is because it would be unjust to do so. It would violate God's intrinsic nature as a just and holy being. And so Anselm presents us with this dilemma. He says, if God is to take care of sin, there must either be an adequate compensation for sin or there must be punishment for sin. Anselm thought there could not be punishment for sin because that would result in our eternal damnation. And therefore, he said there must be compensation. Christ must offer his own infinite life as a compensation to God for the dishonor that we have rendered to God, and thereby the demands of God's justice are fulfilled. By contrast, the reformers, as we'll see, took the other horn of Anselm's dilemma. They said God did, by his justice, punish sin, but he didn't punish it in us properly. He punished it in our representative in Christ, and therefore the demands of God's justice are taken away. So Anselm and the Reformers are on the same footing. They are both concerned primarily about God's justice, and it's because the demands of justice must be met that God cannot simply wink at sin and forgive it without atonement being made.